external critique. Like they're going to say something like, okay, well, if God wants rape to be okay, then rape's okay, right? Like ignoring for a moment the obvious contradiction of that statement, right? Even if that was the case, right? Okay, so God says rape's okay now. What's your argument against that? Like, how do you know it's not? Like, you give me a grounding for why rape isn't okay. So if all their argument is that God could change his mind and all of a sudden rape is okay, if that's it, well then like what's your standard, dude? Because if your standard is just your own mentality, well, you change your mind a whole lot more frequently than God does.
You're talking about me or the atheist?
I'm talking about the atheist, right?
Yeah,
when you argue morality with an atheist,
not as I know what you're saying. You need to put the ball in their field because we're not the one with the
guys. I'm having the debate with him, and he said that you guys can come and watch.
Please don't do that. Please, somebody's talking right now. Okay.
Sorry.
Please don't do that.
I just wanted to let you guys know that I'm having the debate and with him, and you.
Go ahead.
All right. Okay, so go ahead, buddy.
You were saying the ball is in their court because we have the proof. They have a burden for proof because they don't have it, right? Is what you're saying.
We have a grounding for morality, whether God exists, even if God doesn't exist, right? That doesn't mean he's not an effective grounding for morality. Because if I sincerely believe God exists, okay, and I believe that God has a specific authority over all reality, and that he commands X, Y, Z, well then boom, I have a grounding for morality. They don't. So even if my perception is false, I still have a grounding and they don't, right? I'm not the one that has to be on the defensive, right? In order for them to prove that my moral philosophy is wrong, they have to prove God doesn't exist. So like, there's no point even getting into it with them, but like they don't have any kind of moral framework at all. Like you want to fuck with an atheist, ask them to tell you what a human right is.
No, sorry, I think the problem was he kept saying, what's God's stance? And he kept using the word stance. And I was like, what?
Yeah, God doesn't have stances.
That's why I was confused. And I said, what? He doesn't have
that would imply that God opines, but God is the truth maker. Right? God is aware of all true propositions because all true propositions emanate from him simultaneously. If a proposition is true, it's because God made it that way. It's because it is a reflection of his immutable nature.
Yeah.
And then when you tell them that, they're just going to go, oh, that's word salad. But it's not. Well, it's a perfectly coherent statement, and they understand exactly what you're saying when you say that. They're just playing word games. And you got to avoid the word games. Like I said, if you want to mess with an atheist in a moral conversation, just start very simply. What is a human right? You get them to flounder over that for about an hour, and the conversation will eventually deteriorate into nonsense. Because if you do not believe in God, you cannot define human right.
Yeah. Well, that
rights cease to exist as a concept if you're not a theist.
Yeah. I just felt like that guy arguing was very disingenuous. What he was trying to say, he kept trying to.
Yeah, I mean, he obviously knew what you were saying. He was just pretending not to. But yeah, so when we say that God's morality is stance independent, I try to steer clear of words like objective and subjective because they don't add any information to the debate. Whether morality is independent or dependent on a mind doesn't mean anything, because propositions can be true or false regardless of whether or not they're dependent on a mind. And if it's dependent on the mind of God, well, the mind of God would operate differently, obviously, than the mind of human beings. And so, if I were to say that it's your subjective opinion that vanilla is the best flavor of ice cream, right? That's a far cry away from saying that the supreme authority of God, right, declares that this is what we ought behave as, what we ought do. And if you really want to get into it, right, get into that ought is problem, because this is where moral conversations really wind up. Think about it this way, okay? Whenever we say somebody ought do something, like you shouldn't murder or you should give to charity, what we generally mean by that is that these are behaviors which, when done, would bring about circumstances that this person would prefer. Right? You ought not murder because murdering brings about chaos and suffering and strife and all those sorts of things, or it'll wind up putting you in prison, or you'll feel really bad about it, right? You ought not do X because it won't achieve or it will achieve Y, and you do or do not like that outcome. These are rational oughts, okay? Well, a person wanting a particular state of affairs is subjective ultimately, sure. Like, it could be the case that a person does want chaos and therefore they ought to go out and murder and do whatever, okay? But if we can point to something which is logically impossible for anyone to desire, then whatever that thing is, you now have an objective ought. So, for instance, hell. Hell is the worst possible misery. It's logically impossible for anyone to genuinely desire hell or to want the outcome of going to hell. Okay, and because nobody can want that objectively, it is objectively the case that you ought not do things which would lead to your eternal damnation or ultimately winding up in hell.
Yo, Xerxes, what is your view on like intrinsic evils?
Like things that are evil in and of themselves. I would say that
like for example, like necessary like evils. So like they're going to be it's so like for example, raping is going to be evil like in all possible worlds.
Well, that's because God exists in all possible worlds, and rape is something which is fundamentally opposed to the nature of God. I mean, of all the things that God that we know about God, like giving people free will is one of those things. He seems to find free will a very paramount exercise for the human condition. And so it's especially egregious when we violate that. And rape is one of the worst forms of violating free will.
Is marital rape against God?
Yeah.
Oh, not this demonic creature. What is this thing doing in here?
Yes, it is.
I didn't realize you were still alive, Godless.
Hey, what's up, guys?
It's funny, demons still exist.
Let's
Last
be
time
nice.
I heard your voice was like 2018.
Yeah, marital rape isn't even really a concept because if you're in an actual sanctioned marriage, then you're gonna want to be procreative with your partner. Like that's just the grace of Christ. When you're in a God ordained matrimony, like you're gonna have sex with each other and you're gonna want to.
So, like, all the Christian women that were, like, forced into marriage throughout history, that wasn't a real marriage?
Well, if they were forced, then no, that was a sin against God.
That's not true marriage in God's eyes.
That, like, if you look at the Catholic Catechism all the way back to, like, the 4th century BC, or CE, or AD, however you want to say it, I mean, marriage has to be a voluntary union between both the man and the woman. That's one of its very... like most foundational components is it must be voluntary.
I mean, like just because someone did forced marriage doesn't make it like right.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, especially with
I mean, like she's saying "I do" and everything. It's just women were like married off by their parents throughout history and stuff. You know, they didn't really want to be in the marriage, but they would agree.
Well, I mean, we don't. So we can't speak in generalities. Let's assume that there were some women who got married. They didn't want to get married, but they did it to appease whomever. Okay. Well, this would not be voluntary unto themselves, which is why there would probably be strife in the marriage, right? When you actually want to get married, right? Like if you do it in a way that is loving and you desire this outcome, and you understand that this is a union ordained by God. Right, there's going to come with that some benefits and features that aren't going to be in a marriage where one of the participants is not particularly willing. Arranged marriages have been kind of the status quo economically for the past few thousand years, regardless of religion, because obviously parents don't want to give their wives to a man who can't provide for them, and so the man had to prove that he was capable of providing, and then the father got to pick who the groom would be. Because it's the father's responsibility presently to take care of the daughter, right? She's his ward, his steward. And he takes care of her and he protects her. And if she's going to get married, he's going to relinquish that duty to another man. And that man has to demonstrate that he's capable of taking on the burden. Nowadays, we live lives of like hedonistic comfort. And so it's not even particularly important whether or not a man can provide because the woman can just do OnlyFans.
I mean, if husband allows that, he's either a pimp or a weasel.
Well, I'm just saying, like, yeah, I'm aware of. Yes, probably there were quite a few people who were quote unquote married in the past, and one party didn't want to be married, and they had sex and didn't particularly care for that.
And I mean, like the argument of like bad Christians existing is just null and void because it's on both sides of the aisle, right? Because like the bad atheists have existed forever, right? Like I could be like, oh well, there's atheists that run child like slave mines in the Congo, right? Like, this is.
Yeah, I would argue that one of the foundational premises of Christianity is that human beings are, by their very nature, corrupt, flawed, sinful beings, and we do bad things, which is why we needed a savior in the first place. Right? If every Christian in the world acted perfectly, what would they need Christ for?
Xerxes, you're a Catholic now. What do you think about the Catholic Church like getting condoms banned in AIDS-ridden Africa?
The AIDS problem goes a lot further than just the banning of condoms. First and foremost, STDs are virtually non-existent when you are in solely monogamous relationships with a person that you're going to marry, and it's heterosexual, right? Very few heterosexuals get AIDS anyway. So what the problem with the AIDS epidemic in Africa is all these warlords going around raping everybody in sight. Okay, they're probably not using condoms anyway.
But what I'm asking is, do you think condoms ought to be banned in Africa?
Yeah, because condoms are an intrinsic
Yes,
evil.
I think that sex ought to be had within the confines of the marital union, and it should be both procreative and unitive. If it fails to meet any of those conditions, then it's wrong, and you shouldn't be doing it in the first place.
Yeah, just real quick for clarification, are we talking about just like individuals who are Catholic, they shouldn't be doing this, or like are we saying law, legislation, no one can do this thing?
Yeah, I don't think anybody should be doing it because it's a sin against
So,
God.
like, law?
Everybody's subject to the authority of God, whether you believe
Yeah,
you
but
are or not.
Yeah, but God wants us to freely choose and not be forced. If we start forcing individuals to like abide by God's law, I don't think that'd be loving at all.
Okay, but by that argument, then we can just get rid of all the laws because people should just be free to do whatever they want, right?
No, not
Whether or
necessarily.
not I think so a collective of people can decide what I want for the world is that this be the case. People aren't going around having wanton hypergamous sex with a bunch of different people, and that they are having sex within the confines of a marital union, and that it is both procreative and unitive. If they're not doing that, well then I oppose that behavior, and I'm going to vote for a government or vote for a system of authority, a civil authority, which wants to run the world the way that I want the world to be run. This is the modus operandi of every single person on the planet. You try and affect change in a way that accomplishes what your end goal is. My end goal is Catholic theocracy. So, yeah, I mean, you can disagree with me all you want. But
Yeah, sure. But, I mean, the only thing I'm stating, right, is that if it's not something like a determinator of like we can still justify things like within law and legislation, without like bringing up like our own like religious belief, right?
well, I don't think you can because there's no basis for law or morality without God.
Well, I would say, I could like grant that like God could be like the basis of like all of morality, right? But if we're like passing law and legislation, right, and we're saying that this action is immoral and immoral, right? The distinguisher would just be we could make a distinguisher between ethics, where we could in law and legislation, and we do, with ethics and morality, right?
Well, let me ask you a question. Do you believe that anything which is morally good should be illegal?
Which is morally good should be legal.
No. Do you believe anything which is morally good should be illegal?
Illegal, which is morally good should be illegal? No, I don't think something morally good should be illegal.
So you don't believe there's any circumstance in which an act or behavior can be morally good but be illegal?
Oh, well, no, there could be this circumstance, but I don't think that should be the case. But I mean, yeah,
You think that ought not be the case? Okay, that's what I'm making sure. So why then would you believe simultaneously, if you do, that anything immoral should be legal?
Yeah, because like it would just be a distinguisher between ethics and morality, right? Yeah, I could grant and like agree that like doing these things as like Christians would be immoral, right? But as Christians, we're supposed to like have these people freely choose the faith, not force them to. Under your like logic, we should just say we should force everyone to be Christian.
Well, you can't force a
Catholic
person to. Well, you can't force a person to believe a proposition. That's impossible. Okay, but
but you're going to force them to partake in all the practices of the proposition when they don't even believe in the proposition.
Well, it doesn't matter. Like a person can come to the United States and be a communist. They still have to adhere to the laws of the United States. We coerce people constantly into behaving in a particular way based on the will of the collective all the time.
Sure,
Like,
yeah, force can be justified, right?
I cannot force. You're absolutely right. I cannot force a person to be Christian. I can't force them to accept Christ as their Lord and Savior. I cannot force them to participate in the Mass. I can't do any of that. Okay, but what I can do is stop them from behaving in a way that is vile and degenerate and an affront to God. Whether they want to come to church or not, okay, whatever. All right, but you're not going to go around and have wanton hypergamous sex and spread disease. All right, you're not going to deracinate the family and destroy the institution of marriage. You're not going to get to do those things, okay? Because you don't believe what I believe doesn't mean you have carte blanche to now go around and be a foul, rapacious little reprobate. Like you don't get to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only point I'm trying to make here is that this can be taken to like the very extreme, and like under your worldview, we just force non-Christians to partake in Christian actions, right? Things that wouldn't apply to them. And like I would agree, like I believe that there's justified force, right? There's many things in like law and legislation that we can justify, like under ethics, right? My only thing that I'm stating is that this could be taken to the very extreme, and then we would say everyone has to be a Christian, and not just a Christian, specifically a Catholic, and they must all partake in Catholic practices without even believing in the proposition that Catholicism is true.
Yeah, I'd be fine with that.
You'd be fine with that, really?
If you don't actually believe, then there's a lot of the sacraments that you can't partake in, which is the whole point of the Catholic Church, right? You can't partake in the communion. We invite everybody to come to. I think everybody should go to Mass, whether you believe or not, right? You should be within the presence of God. Whether you believe or not is irrelevant, right? Not having the mental assent to God does not invalidate his morals, right? His moral commands.
Okay, so do you think like just the general rule would be that it would be loving to like have someone freely choose to do an action and force them to do an action, just generally?
Well, it depends on the context, right? Like if I have a little, like let's say I had a child, okay, and they were doing something which was destructive to their health, would it be loving for me to let them continue doing that or stop them?
No, because you have an obligation to like protect them. You don't, but we're not obligated to like grown adults.
Well, I disagree with that. To some, I'm obligated to tend to the health of society, right? I live in a society. I live in a collective of people that all depend on one another, and so I have a moral obligation to ensure the health and strength and cohesion of that unit. And the behaviors of non-Christians is overwhelmingly detrimental to that.
Yeah, so you have an obligation in the sense that a non-action, right? You can't like infringe on someone's rights doing an action that like causes them harm. You can't do this, right? But I'm not obligated to like, actively help an individual. I'm not obligated to give them money. I'm not obligated to give them healthcare. I'm not obligated to do any of these things to them. That would be a nice moral thing, fine. But I'm not obligated to do any of these things.
I would argue that you are. You're obligated to operate in a moral way and to encourage a moral behavior in other people.
Sure. Okay, but this is just once again like I could say like giving all homeless people you see $1 is like a really moral action. But I wouldn't then say you walking down the street must give every homeless person you see $1.
No, I would say you ought to do that.
Must I be like a illegality? Must the law force me to do this action? Give every homeless person $1?
I mean, if that's what I wouldn't say the law ought not be that way. It just presently isn't.
Yeah, but I'm saying, should it be that way? Do you believe legally I should be obligated to give every homeless person I see $1?
I'm indifferent to that.
You're not sure?
No, I just like I would need to evaluate whether or not that's something which is actually.
It's a moral action. You wouldn't.
Well,
you wouldn't.
Is it a moral ought that you ought to give all people $1? Like, is that actually a true statement? All homeless people $1? Perhaps it's not the case. Like, I would have to evaluate that. That one isn't so clear, right? So, I mean, I don't really think that falls under the purview of the church. I think you ought to be charitable, right?
Sure.
But you know, there's an extent to altruism, right? You shouldn't be so altruistic as to harm yourself.
Yeah,
it depends on where you live. Like, if you live in a rural area and there's like 4 homeless people, then yeah, go for it, I guess. But if you live in San Francisco, I mean, you're going to go bankrupt before the afternoon is over.
Yeah, I guess the
other thing you mentioned was like rights and what people have the right to do and not do.
Yeah.
First and foremost, rights don't even exist in a non-theistic worldview. I hope you would agree with that.
Yeah,
if you don't believe in God, rights don't exist. And I guarantee you, God does not give people the right to be hypergamous reprobates. Like he doesn't. You do not have the right to go around and have sex with whoever you want and to just do whatever you want all the time. Okay. Yes.
Sure, but God has given us the right to freely choose and to freely not to choose him. He's given us free will, right? And this applies to not just Christians. Everyone that's made in God's image has a free will to choose and has a free will not to. But us like forcing individuals to, you must choose him, you must partake in these practices, even though you like negate the entire proposition of God's existence. You must do these things. That's completely rejecting the fact that God gave us free will. And you could, and just because God gave us free will doesn't now negate like a legality or like a legal system, right? God can still give us free will, and it can still be justified for us, right? But I'm saying having certain individuals partake in one specific religious practice, or even just like one denomination in that practice, just doesn't seem to like be coherent, and just doesn't seem to like hold the principle of, like, generally, if you love someone, you should have them freely choose this belief.
Yeah, that's a very conditional statement. It's not more true in all circumstances. Okay. Now, the reason why, and I mean, we can get into the nature of God debate, but I would say that God's reasons for not coercing people, at least broadly, to believe in Him or adhere. Well, here's the other thing: is that God reveals Himself to people on a selective basis, right? And now you don't have any actual volitional control over what you are and are not convinced of. So it's not like the Israelites could just turn off their awareness of the existence of God back in the Old Testament. Like, they couldn't just not believe in God anymore. They knew He existed. They had direct personal interaction with Him. They still chose to rebel and do things that were a sin against God, and He punished them for that. Like, would that not be a form of coercion? When He opens the ground and sucks Korah and the rebels to the bowels of hell, is that not a form of coercion? Is it not a form of coercion to have Jonah tossed over the side of a ship and swallowed by a giant fish?
Yo, let's go Xerxes.
How about the 10 plagues? You think that was pretty coercive?
Yeah, but one thing I do want to take into account that you're appealing
to say that God is interested in not coercing people to behave a certain way is to paint a patently unbiblical version of God.
Yeah, but
like,
also
there is a time for force and coercion, right? And what I'm saying here is, while I may not have it all figured out, right, my preferred system of government would be a Catholic theocracy.
Okay, wait. I mean, but one thing I do want to take into account is that all the the scenarios about up were in the Old Testament, but also those in the Old Testament that you'd be stoned for adultery. You wouldn't then say that we should stone women and men who commit adultery, right? The death penalty was active in the Old Testament, but we wouldn't then say we should kill Muslims, atheists, or anyone who's outside of the Christian faith, right? So appealing to this does nothing.
I wouldn't say that because Christ's death was the fulfillment of the law, and therefore those penalties have been paid.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, but I'm just pointing out that you're appealing to these Old Testament scenarios that have been fulfilled.
I mean, and I do disagree slightly with the Catholic doctrine on the death penalty, but I do think that there is a point to which we do remove people from society against their will.
Yeah, but it could be justified and unjustified. I would say like removing them from a place. Like, if let's say I own land and you commit and you break law in my land, you have to go, right? But this doesn't mean I get to kill you, right? That would be unjustified.
Yeah, and I mean, we can talk about proportions of force, but when it came to specifically, the Catholic Church, because what Godless asked was the Catholic Church banned the use of contraceptives.
Yeah,
yeah. Yes, okay. So all the people in Africa who are Catholics are not allowed to use contraceptives, and the governments of certain African countries that are Christian don't allow the use of contraceptives.
So I'm guessing you don't believe in So
the majority of people.
Sorry, my bad.
The majority of people in those countries decided to establish or usher in a government which adhered to Catholic principles, and the Catholic principles dictate that you are not allowed to use contraceptives.
Sure, because but you would agree that when we're establishing these things that Catholic principles or just religious principles within legislation, that it should be when it should still grant certain individuals the free will to do actions, right? That aren't unethical.
I would say just flatly that there is to any extent at which I would allow this, most things which I consider immoral, I think should also be illegal. There are very few exceptions.
Okay. I mean, the only thing I'm saying is that your position taken to the extreme would either be communist or that everyone must partake in Christian actions, and it would probably be communist as well.
Well, it wouldn't be communist
or socialism.
No, because ownership and property rights are mostly a matter of the civil authority.